Om Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapah Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shanti Shantireva Shanti Shantirame Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all say what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmaheti Rudrayate Takshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So we will begin today the section on the Atman, the inner self. As we saw last time, that after concluding the discussion on the 5 layers, now the teacher begins discussing the being, the essence of our existence, which is encased inside those 5 layers. We saw verse 210 last time. I'll read it once again. When all the 5 layers are negated to the utmost with reasoning based on the Vedas, what remains is the witness whose nature is consciousness. One phrase that is significant here is with reasoning based on the Vedas. Why should reasoning be based on anything? Oftentimes we look upon reasoning as something that is completely neutral as opposed to faith or belief. What is often not recognized is that even when we apply logic, even when we apply reasoning, there are certain assumptions we take for granted. And so long as those assumptions that we take for granted are taken for granted by everyone else, reasoning appears to be a very neutral instrument. But sometimes those assumptions themselves can be questioned, and then reasoning stands on a somewhat shaky ground. The other problem with reasoning is that there are several instances when a thing can be proved and disproved just using reasoning. One thing that comes immediately to mind is a legal battle, a court case, in which there is the prosecutor, there is the defense, and the common factor is whatever evidence has been unearthed in any crime. Now, what the two sides are working on are based on the evidence that is available, but they are trying to prove 2 different things. And apparently, they try to do it very logically, very rationally. And so, reasoning as a tool is very important, very helpful, but in Vedanta, we recognize that it has its limitations. Besides, reasoning is a tool that is used by the mind, and the mind itself is a limited instrument. So, this is not to belittle the importance of reasoning, but to acknowledge the limitations that it has. And therefore, often in Vedanta, they say that we should apply reason and go as far as it takes us. But it's going to reach a point where it stops. And then the leap beyond that reason is what we term as a transcendental experience, which comes only when we transcend both our senses as well as the mind. And when the mind is transcended, then of course there is no reasoning there, because reasoning is a tool used by the mind. One of the reasons why divine grace is often considered to be unconditional is precisely for this reason, because that grace comes from a space that is beyond the mind and the senses. And therefore, you cannot understand it, you cannot explain it away merely through logic. That doesn't necessarily mean that it contradicts logic. It simply means that logic cannot explain it fully. And that's why the negation of these 5 layers, if we apply logic here, reasoning, based on the scriptures, then it all makes perfect sense. So today we begin with verse number 211. Yoyamatma swayam jyotihi panchakosha vilakshanaha avasthatrayasakshi san nirvikaro niranjanaha sadanandasya vidneyaha svatmatvena vipaschita. This Atman, who is self-effulgent, distinct from the 5 layers, the witness of the 3 states, real, unchanging, without impurity, and eternally blissful, should be known by the discerning to be their own self. In the earlier verse, it just concluded by saying, when all the 5 layers are negated, what remains is the witness. And therefore, this word begin with this, meaning whatever is referred to in the earlier verse is really the Atman. When everything that is possible to negate has been negated, then what remains, and which can never be negated, is the Atman. In fact, sometimes when you might have heard about the category called emptiness. Emptiness is an effort to negate the self. But the self that the Vedanta speaks about is one that can never be negated. And we'll come to the idea of emptiness later on. So this verse gives several qualifiers, several adjectives that describe the nature of the self. We can take them up one by one. Who is self-effulgent? Self-effulgent means, well, obviously, it means that it doesn't need someone else or something else to reveal itself. Just as through the light of the sun, we are able to see other things, but we don't need to bring another light to see the sun. The sun's light reveals the sun as well as everything around it. In a similar way, it's the awareness that the Atman is. It's through that awareness we become aware of the entire universe. Now, how do we become aware of the Atman? Do we need to bring some other entity through which we become aware of the Atman? Or just as the sun reveals itself, even while revealing everything else, the Atman is aware of itself, even as it makes us aware of everything else. And that self-awareness, that ability to reveal itself, is what is called self-effulgent here. Distinct from the 5 layers, we have seen this over time. The witness of the 3 states also. And this is one simple way to recognize what does it mean to be a witness of the 3 self. Is to recognize that to know something, we have to be aware of it. Unless we are aware of it, we wouldn't experience it. So, when we wake up in the morning, we see the sunrise. How do we become aware of the sun? Well, we are able to see the sun, feel its warmth and light, and then say, I become aware that the sun has risen. Now, it's possible that the sun may rise and I may still be asleep. Many people are. And so, for them, for one who is asleep, there is no sun, even though the sun may be shining very brightly outside, because they haven't become aware of it yet. That awareness will come when they wake up and experience the sun. And so awareness and knowledge go together. So the knowledge of the waking world comes to us because we are aware of it. Without awareness, we wouldn't know the waking world. Similarly, when we go to sleep, awareness of the waking world disappears. When we see dreams, a different world opens up before us. But again, if we didn't have awareness, we wouldn't be able to see what is happening in the dream. So, just as awareness brings us knowledge in the waking world, awareness brings us knowledge of what is going on in the dream. Then we go to that third state, when we are not even dreaming, the state of deep sleep. In order to know what is going on in that deep sleep, we need awareness. Now we might say, nothing is going on in deep sleep. But to be aware that nothing is going on, we need awareness. And so when we wake up in the morning and say, oh, I slept well, I didn't know anything at all. So that knowledge of the absence of everything also needs awareness. And therefore, while the content of the three states, waking, dream, and deep sleep, might be different, what is common to the three states is awareness. Without awareness, we wouldn't experience any of these states. And because awareness is the only entity that is common, no matter whether we are awake, whether we are sleeping, whether we are dreaming, and therefore awareness is seen as the witness, the only thing that never ever sleeps throughout existence. And that is why it is said, the witness of the three states, real. Now this topic comes up often, and it's worth reminding ourselves of it as often as we can. What does it mean that the self is real? Now, reality, or the nature of reality, or what it means for things to be real, is not generally the topic of our casual conversation every day. Something we might think belongs only to books on philosophy. And so even though we may not use the word reality in our conversations with people and friends, sometimes the word or the sense of reality comes up without actually using that word. In religious conversation, for instance, when people speak about, do you believe in God? Do you have faith in God? No, we are not using the word reality at all there. But the sense is present. What does it mean to believe in God? What does it mean to have faith in God? It means that somehow, if someone says, I believe in God or I have faith in God, means for that person, God is real. Only then that faith or belief has some sense. Even though a person may never have seen God, but faith in God means that person believes, yes, God is real. Now, what is required for something to be real is experiencing that thing, experiencing something itself a proof that the thing is real. If I see something, I mean, it's a little bit like this. If I now hold this in my hand and I say, there is nothing in my hand. And then we say, no, that's not true. You've got this object in your hand. I can see it, I can touch it, I can feel it. So we often give the example of something that is experienced, something that is grasped by my hands, seen by my eyes, as enough proof that this thing is real. But as I just alluded to, the example of a dream, we see dreams. If I feel thirsty in my dream, I drink a glass of water and it quenches my thirst. I don't see, oh, this glass of water is only unreal because it's only a dream. It doesn't feel that way. And yet, I don't conclude after waking up next morning, that was real because I saw it. So even when we see something, it's possible that it is not real. And therefore, a lot of thought has been given about defining reality. It's not easy to define what is real in words. But what we can do is use the logic that we use in life anyway, but take it to its logical conclusions. A lot of times in life we may see that our thinking is oftentimes right, but it's erratic also, in the sense that we sometimes have a right insight, but we don't apply it uniformly everywhere. That's the problem. So, experiencing something is real is not a complete insight. Because, as I said, we see dreams, but we conclude the dreams are not, at least not as real as the waking world that we see. And what is the reason we think that this experience of the waking world is more real than the experience of dreams? And one answer is very obvious. Every night we have a different dream. Dreams don't last. The dream world disappears when I wake up. And therefore, because it doesn't have that persistence, it disappears, and therefore it's not real. So that's a perfect insight, that if something is to be real, it must have a continuity. And which is why this world appears to be real, because even though it may disappear at night when we are asleep, next morning it just seems to have the continuity. It just feels to be, this is the same world I woke up in, the same world I slept in the previous night. And therefore this world appears to be real as opposed to the dream world. And then, of course, as we have seen on many occasions, we can debate that point as well, whether this world that we see and the dream world that we see, how identical they are. And if the dream world disappears when I wake up, this world disappears when I sleep, and so on. And so, through all these ways of thinking, Vedanta teachers came to one profound conclusion, which is not new, but which is very consistent. And what they said was simply this: if something is real, it is eternal. In other words, there is no such thing as a temporary reality. I mean, what's the point in saying, well, the dream was real as long as I was seeing it? Okay, you can say that, and which is not wrong, but essentially it means it's not real now. Then we could say the same thing about this world also. This world is real as long as I see it. Now, when the self is said to be real, it means the self never ever disappears. The way a dream world disappears when I wake up, or the waking world disappears when I sleep, the self, which is pure awareness, never ever disappears. It's unchanging. Change occurs in only perishable entities. Change means that which is mortal will change. That which has parts will change. I mean, change is essentially some kind of a difference in configuration of a thing. Now, in order for a thing to have a configuration, it must have parts. I mean, if it's just one thing, then what kind of a change can you speak about? And therefore, because the pure awareness has no parts, it's indivisible. It has no boundary. It has no shape. It has no form. And therefore, it is unchanging. Without impurity. So here, one way of understanding this term, without impurity, the Sanskrit word niranjana, means that ignorance itself is sometimes considered to be an impurity. Partly because ignorance distorts our understanding. It directly or indirectly becomes the cause of pain and sorrow and suffering in life. And the self is completely free from it. And therefore it's considered to be without impurity and eternally blissful. Because it is infinite, real bliss exists only in the self. Because everything that is finite may seem to emit bliss, but first of all, that's not it. That's a borrowed bliss. But even when it's borrowed, because the source is perishable, the bliss is also perishable. That's why, while things make us happy in the world, no happiness in the world has that quality of persisting undiminished. Even when we feel so happy at times, maybe that happiness lasts for a few minutes, maybe even a few days if you are lucky, but over time then it kind of slowly begins to go down. Same thing is true with regard to suffering as well. Thank goodness. If there was a suffering all the time, then we wouldn't survive. But no matter how much pain and suffering there is, that also kind of has this wave-like pattern. Over time, the suffering goes down. And so we kind of are going back and forth between joy and sorrow, sukha and dukkha, as it is called in Sanskrit. And so, in contrast to every perishable entity in the world, the self, which is pure awareness, the Atman, is always blissful. And that all of these qualifiers, all of these descriptions apply to the self. And this can be known by the discerning, by those who look deeply, by those who have the Viveka. They will see that within these 5 layers stands the Atman, which has all these qualities. Then, question by the student. Shishya uvacha mityatvena nishiddheshu kosheshveteshu panchasu sarvabhavam vina kinchit na pashyamyatra he guro vidneyam kimu vastvasti swatmanatra vipaschita. The disciple said, O teacher, after the 5 layers are dismissed as appearances without any reality, I don't see here anything other than total void. What indeed should the discerning know to be their own self? It's a brilliant question. We spoke about removing the 5 layers or eliminating the 3 bodies, the gross, subtle, and the causal. And the student is now saying, all of my identity about who I am was centered on these layers. And now these layers are being taken away. I'm being told that they are not the self. Then nothing remains. It's almost like sometimes we use the phrase, we use the thing, pulling the rug under your feet or something, right? Pulling the carpet or rug under your feet. So, I mean, suppose you're standing on a carpet and somebody just pulls the carpet. Of course, you're going to fall down because that's where you were standing on. So, our present self-identity is just we are standing on this rug or the carpet of the 5 layers. And that's both the tragedy and the comedy, if you like, is that we have become aware of the 5 layers because of the self, but we are not aware of the self. Kind of a rather simplistic way to understand that is a candle in a dark room. The light of the candle may reveal the things around it, but oftentimes right below the candle sometimes there'll be darkness. So something like that, as seems to have happened, is the light of the Atman, the awareness of the Atman that makes us aware of everything, but somehow we are not aware of the Atman itself. And so that's what the student is saying. If I dismiss away all these layers and say, they are not me, this is not me, this is not me, then nothing remains. I'm just saying emptiness there. I was speaking with a group recently,
And it was a revelation, sort of. The reason being that those of us who have been reading this text and been listening and reading about Vedanta for long, we somehow seems to say things so casually, so easily, saying, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, this is just a layer, remove it, and it just comes off very easily. But for someone who hasn't even thought about this way at all, this can be a pretty shocking way to speak. Even when you tell someone, oh, inside the layers is the self, which is infinite, pure, immortal. You are that self. This is only the layer. The body is going to perish. It doesn't always necessarily make the person happy. It's like, the body, it's not there, it's going to go. But they know it's going to go. But that the body is not that important compared to something that I have never seen, never even thought about, said to be the core of my existence, and something that I have been living with, seeing every day, is like, it's disposable. It can be a very terrifying thought in the beginning. And that's why, again, we go back to the title and say, looking deeply. If we look deeply, if we think calmly, then all of these things begin to make sense. But otherwise, to an unprepared mind, many of these ideas that we on Wednesday evening speak about may seem either bizarre or sometimes even terrifying. And therefore, it's always good to keep a calm approach and think so that we won't be terrified by this. And that's something like that seems to have happened to the student here. He's like, if everything goes away, I'm just seeing emptiness. And I think he's a great student. The teacher will praise the student's question, because even in order to diagnose the problem, to spell it out clearly, needs a certain amount of awareness, certain amount of clarity in the mind. And therefore, it is amazing, it's wonderful that this student, who is not enlightened yet, but is able to express his difficulties in so clear a manner. That's why, as I have often mentioned, we are not expected to know everything. But if we know what we don't know, if we are aware of, it's not enough to simply have a doubt in the mind. We must be able to express that doubt clearly. And therefore, a lot of times in Vedanta, there should not necessarily be any hurry to get answers. Answers will come, eventually, yes. But I think what we should strive for is to ask the question correctly, to phrase the question well, to have clarity in our questions. As I have sometimes may have mentioned to you in the past, when I studied years ago under a brilliant Vedanta teacher, and we were very young then, many of us, we were young novices in a monastery, and sometimes we were discussing these texts, and we would ask the question to the teacher. And he was so wonderful. He would not straight away give us the answer. He would listen to our question and then say, that's not a good question. And then he would say, it would be good to ask your question this way. So he would refine the question. He would bring some clarity to the question itself. And then a lot of times we've seen that the more we keep on refining the question in the heart, we'll reach a point when we'll find the answer embedded in that question itself. So it's just a learning how to refine, to understand our doubts, to understand what we don't know, to understand what we don't understand, and to be able to express it well. And the student here has done it brilliantly. The teacher now replies. Verses 213 and 14. Shri Guru Ruvacha Satyamuktam Tvaya Vidvan Nipunosi Vicharane Ahamadi Vikaraste Tadabhavo Ayamapyatha Sarve Yenanubhuyante Yasvayam Nanubhuyate Tamatmanam Veditaram Vidhi Buddhya Susukshmaya. The teacher said, O wise one, what you say is true. You are a skillful thinker. With the help of a refined intellect, you should know the witnessing self, who itself is not perceived, but who perceives everything, including modifications such as egoism, as well as their absence. With the refined intellect, the word here is susukshma buddhi. A similar phrase was used in many places in Vedanta, especially in the Katha Upanishad. What it says is that the self, which is the subtlest essence of our being, is difficult to see. So it's not surprising. We don't have to be embarrassed, or I haven't yet seen the self. Of course, it's going to be difficult because it is extremely subtle. Now, in order to see that subtle essence of our being, our mind, our ability to understand has to become subtle as well. And that is what is meant by saying, with the help of a refined intellect. And the way to refine intellect is, first of all, living according to dharma, living according to some ethical, moral principles. Without a strong ethical and moral foundation, the intellect can never be refined. We would never be able to grasp the subtle realities of existence until that refinement can occur. And therefore, an ethical, moral living is extremely important if we want to make any headway in actually experiencing the insights that are presented in this book. So what he's saying is this: with that refined intellect, you should know that the witnessing self, the Atman, who itself is not perceived, but who perceives everything. And this we have seen, that our perceptions is our knowledge of anything right now is a form of really objectification. I can say I know this object. In fact, we even use the word object for things in the world because I'm objectifying it. I'm the subject, the perceiver, the object of perception, and this act of perception connects the subject with the object. So most of the knowledge, whatever we call knowledge in the world, is really a knowledge of objects, it's objectification. And so it's understandable why we cannot know the self the way I know the table. I cannot see the Atman the way I'm seeing a chair, because the chair is an object of my perception. The Atman can never be the object of my perception because the Atman is the subject. It's like saying, when someone asks the question, God can do everything. And can God create an object that God cannot lift? It's kind of a trick question. It's kind of a logical, circular logic. Well, God can do everything, but can God create an object which God cannot lift? Which means there's something that God cannot do. So, the self, it's with the help of the self everything is seen, but the self cannot be seen because the self cannot be objectified. Now, then what does knowledge of the self would mean? Knowledge of the self really means knowing that I am the self. And that's why there is this passage in the Upanishads, Brahmavit Brahmaiva Bhavati. Brahmavit means the knower of Brahman. Brahmaiva Bhavati becomes Brahman. So, what does it mean to have known the Atman, to have seen the Atman? Clearly, not the way I'm seeing everything. So, seeing the Atman or seeing Brahman really means knowing I am Brahman, I am the Atman. As you can see, in order for me to know that I exist, I don't have to look at myself to say, oh, I exist. I don't have to look. I don't have to use my senses at all. So my existence, I know I exist without depending on my senses. I don't need to objectify anything to become aware of my own existence. So the teacher is saying that the Atman is not perceived the way we perceive everything else, but it's with the help of the Atman that everything, and this is important, including the ego. So even when the I sense that I have, as long as that I is connected with my body and mind, that I is not the Atman, that I is the ego. And I become aware of the ego, itself shows that I am not the ego. That ego becomes an object of my perception and the subject is the Atman. 215. Tat sakshikam bhavet tat tat yadyat yenanubhuyate kasyapya ananubhutarthe sakshitvam nopayujjate. Whatever is perceived by a person has that person as its witness. If something is not perceived by anyone at all, it has no witness. So this is the reasoning behind rejection of the idea of emptiness. The student had said that when all the 5 layers are removed, nothing remains. There is nothing. I'm just seeing shunya. I'm just seeing everything is empty. And what the teacher is saying is, if something is perceived by someone, then that entity has a witness. If nothing is perceived, then there is no witness. But now here, you are perceiving that nothing remains. You are perceiving that emptiness. And so that emptiness that you are seeing after all the 5 layers are eliminated has a witness, because how do you even become aware of that emptiness? So that awareness was there. And therefore, this goes back to that circular logic. How can you say that emptiness is real? Because in order to, there has to be someone who have experienced that emptiness. If there is someone who has experienced emptiness, then there is really no emptiness. So that, for instance, and therefore we'll have to rethink some of these terms that are used to describe the word shunya as emptiness, or the word nirvana that is used in often Buddhist literature as the extinguishing of everything. Now, if we understand by that extinguishing of everything as like nothing remains, it's all empty, then the natural question would be, has anyone experienced nirvana? How do we know nirvana is true? And if someone says, well, Buddha experienced nirvana, well, if there was someone experiencing nirvana, then it was not really empty. The experiencer was present. And so it kind of negates itself. And therefore, we don't have to discard the word itself. The word shunya is fine. The word nirvana is fine. Except to recognize what it means is that everything that is mutable, everything that is perishable has been extinguished. And when everything that is perishable goes away, whatever remains is the imperishable. And that is pure awareness. So the teacher really has answered the question that the student has. When the student said, I just see everything is empty after the 5 layers are removed, the teacher says, you are the witness who are seeing that everything has become void. That one who is the witness of that emptiness is the Atman. Look at verse 216. Asau swasakshiko bhavo yatasvenanubhuyate atah param swayam sakshat pratyagatmana chetaraha. This total void or shunya has the Atman as its witness because it is perceived by the Atman. Hence, the inner self is itself none other than the Supreme Self. The reason is obvious that because the Atman is the only existence, you cannot have then, this is the little Atman and that is the Supreme Atman. You again created duality. What separates them two? They don't have any form, there is no body, so there can be only one infinite. There cannot be two infinites. If the Supreme Self is infinite, then that is the only existence. And therefore this distinction, that which sometimes in the beginning is helpful, is useful. Think about the inner self and the Supreme Self. It's very helpful. But at some point, these qualifying terms become superfluous. That which is inside, think about it this way, that let's say if there is a body of water here, let's say there is a small little pond, and then of course there is this big river Charles, and then there is a walkway in the middle, there is a storage drive that goes along. As long as these distinctions exist, I can still say, well, that is the water of the river and this is the water of the pond. Now, God forbid if there's a flood and everything is submerged in water, then how can you distinguish the river water from the pond water? Everything becomes just water. Exactly in the same way, in the beginning, it's helpful for us as long as we have these identifications with the body, the mind, and so on, to think about this deeper reality supposedly encased within the body and mind as my Atman. Really, it's not accurate really. I can't say my Atman when I am the Atman, but that's the kind of a way we generally speak. So the Atman, or the Atman here, as opposed to this infinite Atman. And that's great. But at some point, when we have negated all these so-called divisions, all these so-called form factors that come in the middle, then this Atman here and the big Atman there are no longer separate. And that's how the idea of this one undivided, indivisible reality, which is the self, comes to mind. In fact, at that point, even the word self is superfluous really, because the word self is useful so long as you have to distinguish it from non-self. But if the self is all that exists, you really at that point go beyond words, because whatever qualifier you use, whatever word you use, will give the impression you are trying to distinguish it from something else. When there is really nothing else, then no words are needed. And at that point, it's just silence. And therefore, I will become silent now. We'll stop. And so if you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions, feel free to ask. Yeah.
Hari Om Swamiji. Swamiji, can we objectify the body, mind, ego to help us realize that we are not the body, mind, ego?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and how do we objectify them more?
Good question. I mean, objectifying the body is not that difficult because, well, here it is. So long as we keep looking deeply, keep that Viveka strong, it's not that difficult to know that the body is an object. It's clearly an object of my perception. Well, I cannot see every part of it. I can't see my back. I can't see the top of my head. but I can see. So at least most of my body is an object of my perception. Also, as adults, we know that no matter how well we try to keep the body, there is going to come a time. We may not want it to come soon. Maybe we think about it's years away, but a time will come. Just as we see other people dying, maybe elders in our own family or people that we know passing away when they in advanced age. One day, I mean, every day we are getting older. So even when we celebrate our birthdays, we also know I've gone 1 year closer to my death. But if you think like that, then there probably may not be too much to celebrate. But we know, at least as adults, we may not want to think about it. It's not a pleasant topic. But yeah, one day the body, I'm going to be separated from the body. Objectifying the mind is a little bit tougher, clearly, because it's very subtle. It just seems kind of more, and it's more inside, if you like, if you want to use those terms. And therefore, it needs a certain amount of evolution. I need to, the more attached, the more immersed I am in gross material things, it will be difficult to get over the attachment over the body. But the more my mind learns to live in the world of ideas, emotions, feelings, those are more subtle. And at that level, then the mind begins to somehow become at least as real or more real than the body. So we need a certain amount of subtleness in our perception in order to objectify the mind the way we are able to objectify the body. And then, of course, the last barrier is objectifying the ego itself. So it has to go in a stepwise direction. So for most people in the beginning, it's this clinging to the body itself is such a major hassle that there are larger and subtler battles ahead, inner battles. Yeah. Any other thought? Okay, so we will stop here today, and next week we'll begin with verse number 217. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhuhum. On Sunday, our subject will be lessons from Swami Akhandananda. He was a great disciple of Ramakrishna. His birthday falls on Sunday. He was the pioneers of the service activities of the Vedanta order that he initiated, and showing how it's possible to go out into the world, help those who are in need, while at the same time holding on to these Vedantic principles. Because sometimes people feel this whole idea about non-duality means you have to kind of, if you're negating the world, what need is there to go and serve the world? So he showed in his own life how it is possible to be helpful, to serve everyone around, and at the same time hold on to these very subtle, high principles, and there is no conflict in the two. So it's a very inspiring life to read and to understand. So we'll try to take a brief look at that on Sunday. Next Wednesday we will continue with this study,
and on Saturday we'll have our meditation as usual. So let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Aura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.